Well, good evening and welcome to ACT TV. It's been such a success. We've gone all the way into season 3. This is episode 1 of the season, and we're really looking forward, first of all, to having a discussion with two panelists, both ACT MPs, with some really relevant experience and expertise after what's happened in New Zealand over the last 72 hours since the tragic terrorist attack on our little country on Friday at the Linmore Countdown. We'll also be taking your questions, and we look forward, fire them through in your comments to make it interactive. First, I just want to wrap a few of the things that have happened lately. First of all, level 2 for everyone outside Auckland, and no doubt it will come as a massive relief for people that have put down over 3 weeks so far, waiting in order to be able to enjoy some basic freedoms. There'll be a huge number of people whose businesses have been struggling, whose personal lives have been struggling under lockdown, and kids whose education has been put on hold or at least put under pressure, having to work at home, will be back at school on Thursday outside of Auckland. That's all tremendous news, but the pressure on hospitality will continue. And there is this place called Auckland where a third of the country lives that remains under level 4 for a further week. For its part, ACT has been advocating that the resurgence payment, a one-off payment per lockdown, be extended to a weekly payment. The reason for that is that businesses are getting the wage subsidy, but it's not enough. It's not enough to cover most businesses' wage bills, and it's certainly not enough to cover all of the other bills that businesses face, whether that be rent or electricity and utility bills or rates. Those carry on every week that we're under lockdown, and ACT says that the resurgence payment should as well. If the government is going to make these lockdown decisions because their other responses don't work, we don't believe it's fair that small business owners are constantly copping and paying to stay afloat, especially when many had to borrow under the last lockdown and have only just recovered. It's critical that businesses keep their working capital going so that they're in a position to recover when the lockdowns eventually cease. But it's not good enough to have people running down, going out of business so that they won't be able to make that recovery. We've looked at expanding the resurgence payment furthermore for hospitality businesses under level 2, because even outside Auckland, they may be able to open legally, but with the new restrictions, such as only 50 people in an enclosed space and 100 in an outside space, they're going to find it hard to open profitably. And that's why we think the resurgence payment should apply to all businesses under level 3 and 4 each week, but to hospitality businesses each week under level 2. There's also been a bit of controversy today after I shared a special priority access code for Maori at vaccination centres. We believe in a New Zealand that focuses on the common humanity, where all New Zealanders are born free and equal, and government policy doesn't try to constantly divide people based on their ancestry. We have a look at the policies that governments are putting in place, whether it be local body elections, he puapua, the healthcare reforms, the curriculum of the history curriculum forced into schools, or indeed the way that they go about just about every policy like Three Waters that you can think of. We believe it's time to start championing the idea that New Zealanders are free and equal. We're not responsible for things that happened hundreds of years before we're born. And no country that decided to start treating people differently based on who their great-grandparents were, let alone their ethnicity, has ever found that that is a path to a successful and prosperous society that is fairer for all. That's why we object to the idea that there be special vaccination codes or priority codes for Maori. We also note that what it really reflects is a sloppy government that hasn't got its vaccine rollout right. The biggest mistake they've made is that they didn't engage GPs right from the start. GPs do hundreds of thousands of vaccinations each year. They know about vaccination. They're trusted by people in their community. And critically, they have information about who their most vulnerable patients are. If the government had brought GPs on board, they might have been able to target need and wouldn't be having these cack-handed approaches, which end up being racially divisive, because if you're one ethnic background, you get a priority code, and if you're not, you have to wait in the queue. No doubt there'll be a huge amount of backlash. ACT would rather not be doing politics this way, but we can't stand by when the government is constantly putting in place policies that are divisive and race-based. It's the role of opposition to be able to point out what the government is doing, hold them accountable, and let the people in a democracy make their own judgment of whether government policies are appropriate. And I'm really proud that ACT as a party has been prepared to stand up despite the opprobrium of various journalists and others who simply are unable to report objectively on what's going on. Of course, the big issue that is going to consume Parliament tomorrow, no doubt, and perhaps for several weeks, is trying to change the laws to prevent what has occurred in Lynmore on Friday. It's quite a technical area and there's all sorts of questions. That's why I'm really grateful to be able to bring on board Nicole McKee, one of ACT's MPs who sits on the Justice Committee that is considering the counter-terrorism legislation. Nicole McKee has been at various times a mother of four. She is a woman who was key and instrumental in training hundreds of New Zealanders, often in remote rural locations, in firearm safety. She's also represented her country and been a New Zealand national champion in her chosen sport of rifle shooting. We're really pleased to have her in our caucus because she's made a huge impact in Parliament already, and she hasn't even been there for a year yet. Nicole, you always have a wonderful and calming presence on everyone around you. We're really grateful to have you on ACT TV. How are you going?
Hi, David. It's really good to be back here again, actually, and talk to the community about the issues with the counter-terrorism bill tonight, because, of course, there's so many people out there that wouldn't understand exactly what's going on. So thanks for having me back, and I'm doing great. The family's doing well. We're enjoying lockdown being together. We're lucky.
And Nicole got in touch with me the other day and said, look, I need to prep up on this bill. We haven't been considering it in the Select Committee for the last few weeks. I actually need to go into the office and get my folder. And if you watch how organised Nicole is, she has huge folders. And I said, well, of course, you're an MP, you've got to do your job. Of course, you can go in. But she will be able to talk to us a lot about the detail of this counter-terrorism bill that National and Labour would now like to rush. The other person I want to bring on is Dr. James Mcdowell. Now, I think James might be what you call a polymath or a saint or something like that. He's got a PhD, speaks 4 or 5 languages. He is our immigration spokesperson, and he and his wife have run an immigration law firm, meaning that he's perfectly placed to understand the intricacies of the Immigration Act, the operations of immigration in New Zealand, and how they interact with various people, especially those who are claiming refugee status or that they're trying to deport. Pretty good person to have on board right about now. Welcome, James.
Oh, thank you, David, and thank you for having me.
Yeah. So, Nicole, just to start, we'll get to the immigration part second, but the government, funnily enough, already has counter-terrorism legislation in place. It's been wending its way through the parliamentary process. It passed the first reading in May. ACT voted for it. Nicole, you gave a speech, but you raised some concerns. Can you talk us through what this bill is about and what are some of the concerns that you raised when it first was considered in May? And what's happened since you've been examining it on the Select Committee? You've had public submissions. Talk us through it all.
Sure. So what we're considering in the Justice Select Committee at the moment is the Counter-Terrorism Legislation Bill. And what that is, it's called an omnibus bill, which means it's going to look to amend a number of different pieces of legislation, including the Terrorism Suppression Act 2002, the Search and Surveillance Act 2012, and the Terrorism Suppression Control Orders Act 2019. And the reason why they brought this bill to the fore was because the Royal Commission inquiry from the March 15 mosque attacks actually made some recommendations that those pieces of legislation needed to be updated. They weren't quite fit for purpose anymore because they were so old, and we needed to take into account different measures. So they brought together the Counter-Terrorism Legislation Bill to look to update some of those other acts that I just talked about. Some of the
let's just go through what are some of the key changes that legislation proposed.
So there's 7 really key issues there. One of the first ones is about defining what is a terrorist act. And one of the concerns that we raised in the first reading of the speech was they want to lower the threshold from what is terror to turning it into fear. And of course, we are concerned that fear is too subjective, and who determines what is the line or the balance with fear. They also want to have a criminalization for planning or preparing to commit a terrorist attack. And that
so hang on, because I'm afraid of the Greens' policies. I mean, I think if they were taken seriously, we'd very quickly become a third world country. So, you know, how do you? They must have had some definition of fear. Can I report the Green Party for terrorism under these proposals?
Well, that's the point, is that who could be reported and for what? What is that threshold? Because when you lower it, it becomes a threshold that anybody could actually say, well, I am afraid of the Greens. I think that they're causing fear in the country, or anybody else. So we're sort of saying, let's have a look at that a bit more. But they're also looking at planning and preparation for a terrorist attack. And in doing so, this would have amendments to the Search and Surveillance Act, which would allow the police to be able to apply for warrantless searches of your property and also surveillance. Now, we're saying...
So talk us through that, because you know, normally if the police want to search your home, they actually have to go to a judge and say, Your Honour, we'd like to search Nicole's house. We've seen she's got a legitimate ACT user sticker. She's potentially a climate criminal. You know, Your Honour, can we search your house, right? Are you saying they can just bust into your house and search it without any of that?
Yes, so under the Search and Surveillance Act, they can already do that, but they have to have certain measures in place and meet certain criteria. This would actually lower the threshold and allow them to go in and search your place without a warrant at all. So we have concerns about how that would be used. So we're not saying
this is the kind of thing that would be rushed through.
Yes. So what we have said is we did support it in the first reading, David, but with 7 of these issues, there's a few things that we just want determined a bit better in order to support it through to its second reading and further. But if they rush this without going through the issues, then we have concerns. And of course, some submitters to Select Committee, some organisations, national organisations, have the same concerns and raise them as well. So if they all get ignored, we'll be putting through bad law. Rushed law is never good law.
Yeah, that's right. And the Prime Minister said that we've heard the public, it's time to move. But actually, the Select Committee wasn't due to report back to Parliament for another 2 months. So did you guys just finish your work early, or were you still sort of midstream? I know you can't talk about Select Committee proceedings, but I'm guessing that you still had quite a lot under consideration, and that's why you can't talk about it.
Yes, I mean, we're in deliberation, and deliberations only just started. Effectively, we've only just heard from the submitters. There's a lot of questions raised, and it would be a sorrowful act for New Zealand law if we were to start pushing through or rushing through those deliberations just to meet a deadline that the Prime Minister set.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, you've got a law that criminalises planning terrorism, that redefines terrorism as creating fear, and that's not quite clear what that means. And it also changes a bunch of other supposedly minor matters. And this is what the Prime Minister wants to just pick up and basically plonk through by the end of the month without any real consideration. Because I think this is really important, because a lot of people say, oh my God, there's been a terrorist attack, we must legislate. Well, actually, we've been here before. And the last time, was when we had rushed firearm legislation that's been so ineffective that now, for the first time in our history, we have so much difficulty with gun violence that the police themselves want to carry them to protect themselves. And we're now going to do all of that again. To me, that just seems nuts.
Yeah, I think the difference here, David, is that this is also going to bring in a larger sector of New Zealand society who could be criminalised or even be watched and surveyed just because of their normal everyday activities. And that in itself must concern most New Zealanders.
Yeah, I remember when the search and surveillance legislation went through, and they got a really good balance on what it meant to try and basically have warrantless searches if absolutely necessary, but they only had, I think, if I remember rightly, 24 hours to do that, and then they had to go back and retrospectively get a judge's approval whereas by the sounds of what you're describing, it just becomes open slather for warrantless searches if they think you might be a terrorist, and that can mean that you create fear, and that can mean that you're not actually a terrorist but preparing to be one.
I mean, if you look at the Terrorism Suppression Act 2002, that's having to be updated because they rushed that through in the first instance after the Twin Towers attack, and they did it so quickly that they had mistakes in there. So this bill was meant to fix those mistakes, but if they end up rushing this through, we're just going to create more errors in our legislation and make it unworkable. So we've got to do it right.
Only Jacinda Ardern would think the answer to rush lawmaking is further rush lawmaking. Hey, we're going to bring in James just to talk a little bit about the immigration aspects. So James, as I mentioned, his wife and he have run an immigration law firm for some years, very familiar with the Immigration Act in theory and how it's written, but also how Immigration New Zealand behaves and deals with people if they're refugees or going to be deported, or any other number of immigration situations. So James, I mean, one of the big questions, we've sort of talked a little bit with Nicole about why was he not in jail? He hadn't committed any crimes apparently, and they want to change those definitions and be able to search more easily. But the other question is, how was he still in New Zealand? Is it not possible to deport someone if they're a refugee?
Yeah, well, that's the big question, and it is very difficult to deport someone if they have refugee status. Now, in this case, in 2019, he actually lost his refugee status, but of course, we have the right to appeal in this country, so he appealed that, and they were still waiting on this decision. And that decision, this takes a very long time in the IPT, the Immigration Protection Tribunal. It's not a quick process. I guess one issue I have is this idea that there's advice from Crown Law that he is likely a protected person. So even though his refugee status was revoked, the insinuation that he would most likely be a protected person prevented deportation or a deportation order being placed on him. So, the government has said they tried every legal avenue. Maybe that's right, but I have some questions about that as well. Did they try Section 163, and people can look that up in the Immigration Act? That's the deportation liability of persons threatening security. And in terms of,
I'll just cut in there because this is where it gets quite technical.
Yeah.
So first of all, it's possible but difficult for a government to deport someone who has refugee status if they pose a threat to national security. And the minister has the ability to declare that they are. And the question you were asking is, did the Minister of Immigration actually make the declaration? So that's the first thing. It seems the refugee status doesn't necessarily stop him being deported. The second issue is, was he what's called a protected person? Now, just talk us through, what's the difference between a refugee and a protected person under the immigration law?
Yeah, well, he was initially in 2013 on appeal, granted refugee status, and that was the primary thing that he was given. He wasn't declared a protected person because it was considered unnecessary at the time. He's got refugee status. But a protected person is simply a case where you say, if you deport this person back to the country that they have protection from, would they face torture or imprisonment, unfair treatment or whatever? And if the answer to that is probably, then they are in theory a protected person. They didn't go through that process. They just assumed it based on the advice from Crown Law. But I mean,
that's what you're saying. First of all, sorry to interrupt, but there is a legal barrier to a person who's a protected person being deported. Yeah. But so far as we know, he wasn't a protected person. The government decided to second guess the law and didn't even try in case he became a protected person.
Yeah, that's right. And while you're appealing a decision from the IPT or along those lines, you can't actually have a deportation order placed on you. So you can have a liability notice, that's step one, but the deportation order, you can't just do that to someone who's currently appealing a decision.
So a couple of things that ACT's proposing. Number one is, if you are a protected person, and then the law says you can't be deported to somewhere where you might be subject to torture or other persecution. And that you can understand why the law would say that. The only thing is that it doesn't put in place any consideration of protecting everyone else in New Zealand if that person themselves is a threat. So we're proposing to change that so there's actually a balance for a protected person, just as there's a balance for deporting a refugee. But the second thing here, if I'm getting this right, and you're the immigration expert here, is that there's also no way that they can detain the person, or is there? If you can't deport someone, can you at least put them on detention or put them in prison so they're not a threat to everyone around you?
Well, this is the question I have for the government, and was Section 163 enacted with it? Did they try and deport them on that? But even if they didn't, what about Sections 318 and 323? And this is a case where you can detain someone long term. So 323 is longer than 6 months, and if you look at 318, it talks about if they're a threat or a risk to security. So there are some additional powers hidden away in the Immigration Act. Whether or not the government went down that path, they haven't said anything about it. So I'd be wondering about that too.
Okay, we'll just go to a few questions. So we've given a sort of a pretty expert view from James about the ins and outs of the immigration. I've tried to explain what Act would try to change to give the government more powers in these very specific cases where a protected person or refugee is also not only in need of protection themselves, but a threat to those around them in New Zealand. Now, some of the questions coming in, we got some interesting questions. First of all, from Cassie, why was he not charged on conspiracy to murder? There's people in jail for that. Surely enough evidence of planning such. Cassie, that is an excellent question. If Nicole or James want to jump in, they may know more about that than I do, but I'm not entirely sure what the threshold for charging someone with conspiracy to murder is, but it would certainly seem that he had those plans. Whether or not he'd conspired with another person to do it might be the question. Nicole, James, you guys anything to add on that?
Yeah, when you're looking at a conspiracy to commit murder, you've actually got to meet a number of thresholds. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but what it does show me is that you actually have to, well, the police would have to show that there's an intent for him to do something. And while they suspected he wanted to do something, they didn't know what that was. So you can't take that to a judge and say, we think he's going to do this, but we've got no evidence to say it. It's just that he's been looking at these horrific videos and he's bought a knife and he's not a very happy fella. So that's not enough to meet the threshold for the courts to be able to say there's conspiracy there, so we'll lock him up. So they obviously couldn't do that. I think they would have tried if they could have.
There we go. I just want to be clear, Act TV is not a legal advice program, but that is a very good answer to, I think it was Jenny's question. Actually, so this is Jenny. That was Cassie. Jenny's saying, so his rights were more important than mine or yours. If by his going, his life is at risk, we must protect him. Okay, but his staying means my life is at risk. What then? So I think Jenny's really got to the nub of it, that the government was flailing against laws that were set up to protect the protected person or the refugee, but the law didn't consider what if that person themselves was a threat. I think that's very much what we're trying to get at here. And Jenny, the answer is we're proposing changes that actually the government does have a requirement to balance the safety of everyone else in New Zealand against the danger that the person might face if they were deported. Now, this shouldn't be something that comes up very often. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of people each year who come to New Zealand in great danger. They'll never pose anything like the danger to New Zealanders that they face overseas. However, it is absolutely critical that we start putting that balance in place so that when cases like this do happen, the government can actually weigh them up. We've got a few more questions. David, you go for it.
Part of the amendment on the counter-terrorism legislation bill, one of the last aspects of it is actually looking to change the Terrorism Suppression Control Orders Act. And that would allow police to actually be able to detain somebody who they had fear that would go out there and commit a crime. So what ACT was saying was, take this bill that you've got and separate some of these bits and put through what you think you need to under urgency, like that aspect, because we could get in and support that to keep New Zealand safe now. We just have problems with some of the other aspects of that bill, but it is actually there in that legislative bill to be considered.
Yeah, look, I think that's a very important point, and something we've also advocated for in the last few days, is that it may be possible to have it both ways. Don't rush all of the legislation, because there's clearly some very concerning parts of it that need more time to be thought about. But if there are parts that do need to be rushed through, then those should go through quicker. And I think if we can get that sort of a win-win up, then I think we will have made a big difference to the way this lawmaking process goes. At the moment, Labor just want to pass it by the end of the month for political theatrics, frankly. The Nats have seemed to have joined them on the historical amnesia bandwagon, forgetting the reason we have bad legislation is precisely because of this kind of rushing in the first place. I just want to go to a question from Christina. This might be one for you, James. Why are immigration visa processing times falling so appallingly behind with no immigrants coming into the country? When I got my residency in 2017, the processing time was 6 months. It's more than 1 year now. James, is that what you're hearing from people that get in touch with you as an MP about processing times? And if so, why? I mean, surely with the borders closed, it would be a great time for Immigration New Zealand to clear the backlog, refine and reform their systems, and get ready to process even faster when the borders reopen.
Well, you'd think so, wouldn't you? What Christina said there, it's more than a year now. It's worse than that. It's 27 months, and I can only see that going up. Why has the skilled migrant category stalled so much? Why is it taking so long? I think it comes down to government initiative and what they're actually putting into the immigration system in terms of what the minister wants. They've actually haven't taken any more expressions of interest for residency since April 2020. So they haven't even been adding to it, and yet the delay gets longer and longer. So hang
on, are you saying that you say what the government wants? I mean, are you saying that the government is deliberately putting sand in the gears and slowing down processing as part of its general anti-immigration policy?
Oh, yeah, well, it would seem that way.
Michael asked, why does the law need to be fast-tracked? And he says, are there more people that need to be deported for terrorism? Well, the other thing I'd say, Michael, is that the law won't apply to things that happened in the past. So the point you're trying to make is maybe even stronger than you might realise. They can't deport people for things they did before this law passes. So unless they think that somebody's going to break the law in the next 2 months, which is basically how much they're fast-tracking it by, then it's not going to make any difference. Now, of course, there's a possibility that someone will do something that would have been illegal if the law was fast-tracked in the next 2 months. I think if that was the case, the government should have got onto it years ago rather than trying to fast-track it at the final hurdle. So look, I don't think that it's possible that that's the reason, but you're actually completely right in what you're saying. Just to go back to James, sorry, I kind of cut you off there. So from ACT's point of view, I mean, what would we do about visa processing times? Because it's a huge grievance right across the migrant community in New Zealand.
Yeah, well, it's unacceptable how long it takes to get residency, and then the fact that they're not accepting EOIs. So we have said we would resume that, start taking those up again, and offshore processing for partners of work visa holders here. There may need to be some very big interventions in the skilled migrant category of residency to actually get those processed. So a few big decisions need to be made there because they've got to speed that up.
All right. Well, look, thank you very much, James, Nicole, bringing all your expertise and knowledge. Nicole, I never knew you knew so much about conspiracy to murder. I don't know whether to be admiring or slightly concerned. But thank you very much for sharing that. I hope you guys both have a really great night. And to everyone tuning into ACT TV, thank you very much for supporting us through season 3. We're going to be back tomorrow night. But as it turns out, Peter Williams is not the only one who's no longer a host today. I've actually been fired. There's been a regime change, and Brooke Van Velden, our deputy leader, will be hosting ACT TV tomorrow night. And as I understand it, she's going to have on Chris Bailey to talk about some of the pressures that small business are facing. We had Chris on a couple of weeks ago. We've since rolled out new policy that we talked a bit about today. So we're going to talk a bit about small business with Brooke Van Velden and Chris Bailey and perhaps other ACT MPs. So if you're interested in that space and how small business comes out the other side of this COVID pressure, then I hope you'll tune into ACT TV 7 o'clock tomorrow night. Thank you. Have a great night.